Okay, I'm going to give you a couple of pointers to this chapter called The Nature and Power of Images. It's fairly dense, there's a lot in here, so I'm just going to point out some things that are probably worth paying attention to. To start off, the author, Anne-Marie Seward Barry, talks about neurologically, all images are by nature gestalts, made up of fragments of visual experience, processed modularly and then coordinated through perceptual processes. So, one of the things that she's arguing is that information comes in through our eyes, and then we create wholes out of it. Basically, we make stories out of it in our head. So, the whole point of the first section, going from page 69 up to page 75, is that images hold a privileged position not only in poetry but also in relation to our innermost beings. What visual images express can only be approximated by words but never fully captured by words. Words represent an artificially imposed intellectual system removed from primal feelings. Images plunge us into the depth of experience in itself. So this is a sustained argument for the superiority of the image over the word for many reasons. She makes sort of an attack on the bivalent logic of science that misrepresents the world of things that change. She talks about the fact that for us to process linguistic information, first we have to perceive it, and then we have to sort of digest it and make sense of it, and images we get immediately. So there's something about the immediacy of images that makes them more powerful than words. In the next section, Primal Invariance, Cave Art to Comics, the author talks about the idea that the earliest art and some of the most powerful art is not imitation, but instead it is psychological projection. So if you remember, one of the first images in this canvas site is the Lascaux cave paintings. These are paintings that people did 17,000 years ago, painting largely of animals that they hunted. And the belief is that there was this sort of magical connection wherein the artist would paint a picture of the bison they wanted to kill, and then they would take their spears and they would try and like stab the bison that was on the wall, and that this was going to help them become more successful when they're trying to hunt the bison for food. And so the author here is talking about cave art as getting to the very basis of something. So one of these bison. So even though these paintings may not look as realistic as later artists were able to depict, what they did was they presented the essence of that thing that they were trying to capture. And they weren't just trying to capture it to have decorations on their wall, but they were capturing it for the ability to have power over it. She goes on to talk about comics and also children's drawings. And one of the things about comics and children's drawings is that they are often more informative than detailed drawings that are accurate representations of things, because what a child or what a comic artist often does is distilled and gets the very essence of that thing that they are trying to communicate. So she would argue that cave art, children's art, and the art of comics are superior to other kinds of arts in terms of them being able to communicate to us the most essential aspect of something that is being represented. In the next section, which the author calls image affordance, she talks about this ability of a drawing to focus on some most essential aspect of that which is being depicted. To perceive the world, to grasp the meaning of a drawing, and to create satirical image, each of these depends on the grasp of essential characteristics and the implications of these as symbolic. That is, they suggest relationships or tell a story. So she talks about the fact that the horns depicted on the bison in the cave paintings are larger than they really would be, and they're more pointed. And that's because of the notion of affordances. She writes, affordances may be defined as attributes of things within the environment that assert themselves to our consciousness by the potential utility or danger. Those chairs become significant to us because they invite us to sit on them, while for the Cro-Magnon hunter, horns of animals meant the possibility of being impaled. Because an animal's horns probably represented the greatest danger to primitive humans, they not only became prominent features within cave art, but also often seem to be exaggerated in their size and elongated as well. So the idea that the cave artists would exaggerate the horns, this is because they're getting at the essence of something. And so what this author is saying is that cave paintings and children's drawings and caricatures are not primitive or crude, because what they do is they distill down to the essentials of something. In the next section, labeled Inner Necessity, the author takes on what might be considered to be the Western philosophical bias against image in favor of words. She starts off by talking about Plato, who insisted that art was an imitation and therefore twice removed from nature and inherently dangerous. And she discusses the fact that his student Aristotle had a slightly better view about images. But the crux of this one has to do with the idea that there is perception and then there is conception. So you perceive something, and then what you have is a mental conception of it. And she would say that we have a long tradition, particularly in the modern West, of making perception have a weaker second-class status to conception. So there's a paragraph in about the middle of page 83. Persistent to the present day, the false thinking that separates perception from conception, which relegates perception to an inferior position, and which places concepts in the realm of propositional reasoning rather than parallel to percepts governed by the same process, has resulted in a panoply of erroneous ideas, many of which have been treated in the first chapter. Chief among them, however, are that we are preeminently rational beings in control of our own thoughts, that our beliefs are founded in reality, and that linear logic can be used as the acid test for the truth of various postulates. So she'd go on to say that there's plenty of sources of logical error, and even though admitting that because our senses can deceive us doesn't, that's problematic, but it doesn't mean sense perception bad and logical perception good, which is a bias that many sort of forces in Western civilization would sort of be supporting, and Plato would be one of the most outspoken advocates of that position. In the next section, mental imagery, the author makes several interesting points about the various ways in which we can use mental imagery to accomplish things. So she mentions specific, famous inventors who came up with all kinds of breakthroughs, who sort of see their inventions, or people who seem to have a disability in one area and have an incredible ability in another area because of their sort of being visual thinkers. Einstein is often described as someone who wasn't particularly good with language and math as a child, and some of his greatest breakthroughs come from him doing these thought experiments where he's sort of seeing the results before he kind of turns it into language and formulas. One of the more interesting things from the point of view of business communication has to do with the idea of we've got these sort of mission statements and vision statements. So lots of world-class athletes become world-class athletes by working with people who do them, engage them in sort of guided imagery. So they see themselves hitting the home run. They see themselves throwing a strike. They see themselves crossing the finish line before their adversaries. And this has sort of considerable power. When we get into, I think it's probably on page 90, in business, the idea of belief in a vision has taken on the significance of a megatrend in the last decade, as leaders have come to realize the importance of creating a unified corporate vision sufficient to motivate associates and employees. One function of corporate advertising, for example, is to define the corporation image not only to the public, but also to the employees themselves, so that they can project this image consistently to consumers. So we've now moved from the idea of an image as some physical thing that comes into our eye and on the back of our retina, and then our brain creates these stories about what it is that we're seeing, to a broader interpersonal and social notion of the image. And so further later in the chapter, she's talking about people who engage in either visualization or practice, and that the people who visualize a certain outcome improve just as much as the people who practice it. So there are some sort of powerful ideas in here that some people would say, well, that sounds, a little mystical to me, a little hippy dippy. But one of the things we'll be talking about later in the semester is the notion of a vision statement, and what is the relationship between a mission statement and a vision statement. Because some of the most powerful corporations in the world right now seem to have gotten there by their ability to guide all of their players onto some vision of what it is that they will be accomplishing. Finally, the author closes with a discussion of the metaphors of mind. So, thanks to the influence of computers, many of us have this metaphor of the mind as some kind of a computing machine, and there are a lot of limitations with that. That the human mind probably can do an awful lot of things that the most powerful computers can't do. Most powerful computers can do certain simple things amazingly quickly, but that even a not particularly strong mind can do many more phenomenal things. So there's a problem with the CPU-based metaphors of the mind. But she concludes the article by talking about some of the challenges and some of the sort of opportunities that images represent. She seems to be particularly concerned about the way that advertising can use certain techniques to get us to believe that a certain commodity is going to satisfy some tremendous inner need that we have. And she concludes by saying, such reduction to the lowest common denominator neither reflects the true complexity of real life experience nor promotes the complex thinking required to deal with the multiple factors within that experience. So, overall, this chapter covers an awful lot of territory, and much of it is sort of filled with praise for the power of the image, an indictment for some of the traditional Western rational intellectual processes that seem to value words over images. But then she ends with something of a cautionary note about, because of the power of images and because of the ability of some people to manipulate images, we all might be at greater risk due to sort of the increased presence of images in the communications that we receive on a regular basis. So I hope this brief synopsis of the chapter is useful to you as you try and sort of work your way through what it is that this author is saying.